Egypt, a land of buried treasures, unanswered questions, spectacular finds. A secluded valley holds 63 tombs, networks of tunnels and chambers, cut to hold the bodies and the wealth of Egypt's rulers. Today's Egyptologists are gaining new insights into the scale of what was achieved here. Can they explain why an underground world, the most famed and elaborate cemetery in history, was hidden, forgotten, beneath the Valley of the Kings? Dr. Zahi Hawass is Egypt's chief archaeologist. He believes he's identified the starting point for one of the most extraordinary engineering projects ever undertaken. A doorway in the cliffs which ring this valley. The entrance to a tunnel which leads to a tomb.
I really do believe this is the first tomb that was cut in the Valley of the Kings. It's about 210 meters, almost more 650 feet, cut in the rock.
For 500 years after this tunnel was built, the pharaohs of Egypt were brought here to be buried. This is where they began their journey into the afterlife.
The Valley of the Kings is the burial place of some of the greatest rulers of antiquity. It is a sacred place. It is the place where their mythology is played out, where they have pooled all their thoughts, their technology, their craftsmanship. Incredible resources have gone into the creation of these royal tombs.
3,500 years ago, the pharaoh's religious capital was Thebes, the heart of the most sophisticated civilization the world had ever seen. This was a golden age in Egypt's history, and here the pharaohs demonstrated their greatness for all to see. But in a valley less than 4 miles west across the Nile, they created something every bit as extraordinary, away from public view. The Valley of the Kings lay undiscovered until the 19th century and the coming of the first modern Egyptologists.
The whole of ancient Egypt was forgotten until the arrival of these architects, engineers, chemists, doctors, and draftsmen. And these men began to explore Egypt. And as they did so, the antiquities of Egypt began to re-emerge. And of course, amongst the most noticeable was this valley known now as the Valley of the Kings.
Today's Egyptologists follow in the footsteps of the early tomb hunters. Working without maps or any real idea of what they might find next, these first explorers dug out chamber after chamber. Each one had been carved with precision, often richly adorned with paintings and hieroglyphs. Archaeologists were beginning to glimpse a man-made underworld of staggering complexity.
But ever since then, more stuff is coming out of the ground, and very gradually we're unpeeling the layers and the history and the significance of this just unbelievable canyon.
Perhaps the greatest find was made by Howard Carter in 1922. All the burial chambers previously discovered had been empty. Then he opened the intact tomb of Tutankhamun. It yielded a fabulous haul, including vast quantities of gold. And yet it's just a fraction of what experts now believe the valley once held.
We have one tomb, and it's incomparable. It's unique, the tomb of Tutankhamun. When you compare it in size and in importance with other tombs that were excavated in the valley, it's very, very tiny and probably quite insignificant. So the mind boggles, really. By accumulating evidence over the years and the research that is being done, we are now able to tell a story which we couldn't even 10 years ago.
Much of this research has been done by Kent Weeks. He spent 30 years studying ancient documents, excavating and systematically mapping the entire region. He's documented every discovery ever made in the Valley of the Kings.
For the first time, we were able to see all of the plans of all of the tombs laid out on a single sheet of paper. And then when we translated those into three-dimensional drawings on a computer screen, we could see in 3 dimensions how they related one to another. I don't think anyone was prepared for the apparent confusion. This corridor is running in every which direction.
Weeks's computer modelling revealed the valley as it had never been seen before. 2 miles of corridors and chambers stretching out beneath the surface. There was a confusion of styles, sizes and designs. From what looked like an underground palace to a single room reached by a vertical shaft. Some of these tombs twist and turn, others run dead straight. They crisscross each other, some even collide. But why were they there? For centuries, the Egyptians had laid their kings to rest in pyramids. The Great Pyramids of Egypt were built 1,000 years before the valley tombs were cut. Their design was based around a set of principles which the pharaohs believed would guarantee their entry to the afterlife. Archaeologist Dr. Daniel Poltz has investigated the move from grand monuments to hidden burials. He believes the shift was sudden and dramatic. He excavated an area on a hillside between the valley and ancient Thebes. And there he found fragments of a pyramidion, the sacred stone which sat at the pinnacle of the pyramid. It bore a cartouche, a royal name. Next, he uncovered a square foundation wall of mud brick.
The structure indeed was the lowermost layers of a mud brick-built pyramid.
Poltz dated this modestly sized pyramid, reconstructed here, to the time of Egypt's 17th dynasty, 1,000 years after the Great Pyramid, but just a few decades before the Valley of the Kings. The dynasty which built this pyramid was honoring an ancient and sacred tradition. The pharaohs of the next dynasty, the 18th, would have seen this structure standing complete, yet they turned their backs on that tradition.
We know for sure that no tomb in the Valley of the Kings ever had a pyramid. Pyramids simply ran out of use.
The question of why this happened has long been debated by Egyptologists. But for Dr. Zahi Hawass, the answer lies at the bottom of this, the deepest and, he believes, the oldest tomb in the valley. Again, Howard Carter was the first person in the modern era to enter the tomb. It was in 1902, 20 years before he happened on the burial of King Tut. Carter entered a passageway blocked by rubble and debris.
The smell of the bats and the loose stones made Carter's life miserable. It's very rough and very difficult, and you see, while I was entering inside, I almost slipped down because it's difficult and dangerous tomb for anyone to enter.
This passageway was intended to be used once and then sealed forever. It kept spiraling down, but Carter pressed on. After more than 600 feet, he came to the end. The tunnel opened into a burial chamber. It held 2 large empty sarcophagi. One of them bore a name, that of a great queen. The pharaoh, who archaeologists believe turned this valley into the Valley of the Kings. This remote valley became the richest burial ground in the ancient world. To understand how it happened, archaeologists have focused on the pharaoh whose tomb they believe is the oldest and the deepest here. That pharaoh's name was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut belonged to a golden age in Egyptian history. An era when every ruler sought to leave a legacy in stone. Columns, temples, intricate carvings, evidence they had the will and the resources to build big. Hatshepsut's name is on the biggest monuments of all. It's on this obelisk, weighing 300 tons and at 97 feet, the tallest in Egypt. But to understand what brought her to the Valley of the Kings, we have to look at the nature of Hatshepsut's reign. Hatshepsut was a rarity. A female pharaoh in a country that did not even have a word for queen.
Hatshepsut's rise to power really can be traced back to her childhood as a daughter of the great warrior pharaoh Thutmose I. She clearly inherited her father's drive and ambition.
She grew up to marry her father's successor, but when he died, the throne passed to his young son.
She clearly felt, as the daughter of a warrior pharaoh, that she could do better than a mere infant.
Hatshepsut set about proving her point in the best way that the pharaohs knew. She built. On the outside of the cliffs which shield the valley, she built a temple where she could be worshipped after her death. It was rediscovered beneath sand and debris in the 19th century. It is still being excavated. Archaeologist Ted Brock, who's been working in the area for nearly 20 years, has been probing what the temple reveals about the ambitions of Hatshepsut. Colossal statues of the queen line the temple's top level, and in the details of the carving, Brock believes you can see a grand plan in action. Right down to the color of the statues.
She has typical male's red skin as opposed to the yellow skin females are shown in Egyptian art with. Also, she had at one time a beard, like the other statues up here. And you can see the chin strap that is attached to her.
In these statues, Hatshepsut has made herself into a man. This entire structure is testament to her desire to compete and be remembered as a mighty ruler.
Because she is calling herself a pharaoh, she had to take on the guise of a pharaoh, the trappings, the costume, the imagery of the pharaoh.
The temple itself was part of this. It had a specific practical function.
It served as a focal point for the offering cult for the spirit of the king in the next world.
A pharaoh expected to spend the eternity after death in the company of the gods. Food and drink to sustain him would come from offerings left at his mortuary temple. Built for this purpose, Hatshepsut's temple is said to be the most impressive of its kind.
And people have always marveled at the beauty of Queen Hatshepsut's temple. It's wonderful, sheer cliffs, and then the brilliance of taking this long series of staircase-type colonnades turns Hatshepsut's temple into a masterpiece.
But while previous pharaohs attached their mortuary temples to their tombs, Hatshepsut hid her burial place some distance away.
What we have is visibly an enormous, fantastic mortuary temple, and visibly no tomb. So the elements have been split up. The king, from this moment onwards, is to be buried in a hidden place, the deep underground passage in the Valley of the Kings.
Egyptologists concluded that the most obvious explanation for this was security. Nearly every time a royal tomb has been discovered in Egypt, robbers have got there first. The exception, the intact tomb of Tutankhamun with its vast riches, reveals why big monuments were clearly a magnet for thieves. For decades, it was accepted that Hatshepsut and her successors hid their tombs to prevent robbery.
This, I think, is not a possible explanation. If you look at the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, excavating them, decorating them, actually bringing in the royal burial involves hundreds, if not thousands, of people. How can you possibly hide such a tomb from the locals, from the workmen?
Archaeologists have also spotted something about the position of Hatshepsut's temple in the landscape. It suggests the temple is just one element in a much grander scheme. If a line was drawn down the grand stairway and back across the Nile, it would pass the central walkway of the Karnak Temple, the most sacred place in Egypt and one of the largest temple complexes on Earth. Over a distance of 2 miles, the alignment between the stairs and the walkway is just 2 degrees out.
When you consider that this would have been a line of sight with just bare eyes on the part of the Egyptians, determining that is remarkably close, too close to be coincidence.
In Egyptian theology, the journey between East and West was sacred. It was the daily journey made by the sun god. The Egyptians built their towns on the east bank of the Nile, where the sun rose. They buried their dead on the west bank, where the sun set. Hatshepsut had forged a connection between the two.
The shrine of Amun at Karnak is the beginning of a master plan. Going from east to west, you arrive straight at the temple of Hatshepsut. It doesn't end here, because if you go on tracing the line of this master plan through the mountain and the great limestone cliffs at Deir el-Bahri, you end straight into the tomb of Hatshepsut herself.
But Daniel Poltz believes the tomb was not the final destination. He thinks Hatshepsut dug here because it was the starting point for another perilous journey.
I think the place where she put her tomb was thought to be the entrance of the netherworld. That was the point where the netherworld started.
The conventional theory was that the tombs were placed underground simply to keep out tomb robbers. But archaeologist Daniel Poltz believes the tomb builders were less concerned with the dangers of this life than the next. His theory is based on clues found in Hatshepsut's burial chamber. Amongst the debris was a series of limestone slabs painted with hieroglyphs and images. They make up the oldest known example of an ancient burial text called the Amduat.
The Amduat is an ancient Egyptian word for what is in the netherworld. Her version of the Amduat is the first we know of.
By day, a resurrected pharaoh traveled with the sun god through the sky. The Amduat described the journey through the hours of the night and the darkness of the tomb. The god has the head of a ram and is shown aboard a boat. He must fight and talk his way past other gods, demons, and monsters. Finally, he passes through the body of a snake before being magically reborn as a scarab beetle, the symbol of the dawn. These elaborate images are more than decoration. They form the basis of a map or manual.
You have to have a description of what waits for you in the netherworld. What kinds of creatures, demons, gods you have to deal with in the netherworld.
According to Poltz, Hatshepsut hoped that coming to this valley, beyond the Nile and behind a ridge of cliffs, would bring her closer to the world of the dead.
Well, I think that Queen Hatshepsut actually wanted to place the entrance of her tomb as close to the netherworld as possible. And that was the Valley of the Kings.
A series of carefully planned rituals would have begun at the moment of Hatshepsut's death. Her body would be needed in the afterlife, so first it was mummified. Then it was transported in its coffin across the Nile, up the side of the valley, and then down into the burial chamber. Hatshepsut's funeral procession marked a new route to the afterlife. Many other pharaohs would follow.
Hatshepsut started something which then lasted for more than 500 years and produced many of the most important buildings that Egypt has ever done.
That the tombs would be hidden from the eyes of the living did not matter. Tomb builders went to extraordinary lengths to achieve absolute precision.
When we were doing our mapping in the Valley of the Kings with very sophisticated 20th century technology, we often found that we would have to take hundreds upon hundreds of measurements in a tomb to reflect the accuracy of the ancient engineers.
The engineers of ancient Egypt worked with the most basic tools. But tunneling engineer Steve Macklin, who's undertaken major construction projects all over the world, thinks their work has stood the test of time.
Normally today we might design for 100, 120-year design life. These guys were building for eternity and they're doing pretty well at it so far.
Examining the rock inside the tomb of Hatshepsut, Macklin can see how the unstable layer beneath the limestone would have posed a challenge for the tunnelers.
And now what we see is something called the Esna shale. A shale is simply a rock that was originally mud. But the problem is this material is not so stable. The slate breaks in very thin pieces. It's much more easily excavated, but also less stable as a result.
But Macklin has observed that the engineers avoided this problem by digging exploratory well shafts to test the suitability of the ground beneath them and adjusted their plans accordingly. He recognized the technique because it's one that engineers still use today. The best example of this is in the tomb of the great king Seti I. Its well shaft did hit the layer of shale. It's possible the architect then changed his designs because the all-important burial chamber rests just within the solid limestone. The shaft is one feature that appears in many of the tombs, copied by generations of workers. Kent Weeks, who has made a 3D model of the valley, believes there's a reason why certain features occur again and again.
I don't think it was accidental. I don't think it was based on geology. I think it was firmly rooted in Egyptian religious beliefs.
3D plans of the earliest tombs reveal a sort of blueprint. In time, the spiraling journey that Hatshepsut took into the afterlife is formalized into straight corridors and right-angled turns. But in every case, the burial chamber is at the bottom, and the walls that surround the stone sarcophagus are the focus for visions of the netherworld.
I think the plans of all of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings are probably theologically based. Very simply put, they might have been seen as a roadmap. From the entrance to the burial chamber was meant to mimic the path that the pharaoh would follow as he made his way into the next life.
While the tomb design was honed and improved over time, its basic purpose remained the same over the centuries. 100 years after Hatshepsut, one pharaoh would commission a tomb so lavish that it was doomed never to be completed. What that pharaoh left was a gift for archaeologists. They could unlock the secrets of the men who built the Valley of the Kings. On the southern side of the Valley of the Kings lies an extraordinary tomb. By the time it was dug, the ancient Egyptians had already been burying their kings here for almost 2 centuries. But this tomb, 4 chambers along a straight corridor over 400 feet long, set new standards of magnificence. Whereas the walls of other tombs were painted with images and texts, this one was covered in the most elaborate carvings. Zahi Hawass is retracing the steps of the explorers who first entered this chamber and identified its owner.
They found the name of Horemheb, the army commander.
Hawass believes that Horemheb's story explains the tomb's unique quality. Traditionally, a pharaoh inherited the throne. But Horemheb seized it. He wasn't a member of the royal family, but a general. As commander of the forces of Tutankhamun, he only took power in the vacuum caused by the boy king's death. A tomb had already been started for him elsewhere, but he wanted to be buried as a king in their valley.
He was not from the royal blood. He was a military officer. And therefore, he was afraid that maybe he will not meet Osiris easily.
Dr. Zahi Hawass has studied the images that cover the burial chamber. Here, Horemheb wears the crown of Egypt. He stands with each of the key gods in turn: the jackal-headed Anubis, Horus the falcon, Isis, and the god of the netherworld, Osiris.
He wants all of them to accept him as a king. Look at Isis with the crown of the sun disk. In front of her, Horemheb is giving her offering. That's actually the quest of Horemheb for immortality.
It's a reminder that every tomb in this valley has a clear function: to convey the king to the afterlife. Horemheb's quest led him to create something that successive generations would try to emulate:
The tomb was in itself something of a revolution in tomb design. We have the first example here of a straight axis tomb leading from the entrance to the burial chamber, a plan that is going to be copied by other rulers during the New Kingdom.
But while ambition drove Horemheb to attempt something magnificent, it may also have doomed him to failure. A pharaoh commissioned his tomb when he came to power. Horemheb reigned for 28 years, yet the work was never finished.
Maybe Horemheb died before the artist finished the tomb.
Upon the king's death, the tomb builders had 70 days, the duration of the mummification process, before the burial chamber needed to be sealed. It appears that what Horemheb wanted was so complex, he ran out of time. The result was an incomplete tomb, a gift for archaeologists.
We have examples of almost every stage in the process of smoothing a wall, outlining the decoration, carving the decoration, modeling the details of the relief, and then painting the relief. Every single step is shown, and nowhere in the Valley of the Kings, or indeed in almost any other tomb in Egypt, do we find more information about how the craftsmen worked.
It is like a school. We can learn from this tomb a lot. And it's interesting, you can see this is how they will make the grid on the wall. And they divide the grid.
The grid is the guide by which a design was transferred onto a wall. Teams of sculptors and artists would then set to work.
Then carefully, they have to design what has been put in plan. And the overseer of the artist will come to see if the young artist did exactly what's planned or not. If they see one of them make a mistake, they correct it.
The first rough designs were done in red, and then greater detail was added in black by another artist. It's not clear why the decoration was unfinished, but it looks as if the craftsman downed tools just before the body was placed in the burial chamber. Horemheb's tomb gave the men who found it invaluable insight into the way that tomb builders worked. But until recently, experts could only guess at the lives of these master craftsmen. In 1998, archaeologist Elina Paulin-Grota was clearing a section of land that had previously not been excavated. She came across the foundations of some small stone huts. There, on a fragment of limestone, she found a sketch drawn by one of the ancient tomb builders. A snapshot of life and work in the valley.
It shows the entrance of the tomb, and it shows the architectural features like a door and walls. And inside are persons sitting on a scaffold and hammering on the wall with the chisel and the hammer. And the two are sitting, and the other persons are carrying the debris, the stones, the dust out under them. And it is exactly something that we do now when we restore or work in the tombs.
The fragment helped identify the huts as houses for the men who worked on the tombs. Other similar sketches have been found in the area. Some show architects' plans for the tombs, some are dry runs for their decoration, others relate to everyday life. The limestone flakes were also used as makeshift notepads. They reveal a highly organized setup, with a scribe keeping detailed records of supplies arriving on site and the progress made each day. They even had a method of timekeeping.
We know that the ancient workmen worked in two gangs, a left gang and a right gang, digging and then carrying broken stone out the doorway. They lit their work with small bowls filled with oil in which they would float a tightly wrapped linen wick. And the wick would be cut to a certain length so that as the day progressed and the wick burned down, when it stopped, it was time for lunch. After lunch, a new wick, more oil, and after it burned down, it was time to go home.
The scribe also kept an attendance record.
Many times we have a complete workman's list on these flakes, and there is a list of with names, and is written. One was absent because his mother was ill, the other one was absent because he had to go on a feast, or a third one had to go with the foreman to work somewhere else.
It's not only possible to see how these men worked, there are also enough clues to create a detailed view of their home lives. Following an ancient trail up from the valley floor and over the ridge, a path leads to one of the most important discoveries made in the area. An entire village, just for tomb builders.
The workmen lived in an isolated community, cut off from the rest of Egypt. There was not even running water. It had to be brought in on donkey back. And they lived here, 87 families or so, working every day in the Valley of the Kings or on other royal commissions.
As archaeologists excavated the houses, they found many more stone fragments covered in writing. These reveal the colourful private lives led by the artists and tunnellers.
We know who was fighting with whom, which neighbor was sleeping with the other neighbor's wife, who was stealing, who was cheating in their accounts, and so on. It has the ability to make the Egyptians more human than almost any other single archaeological discovery in Egypt has ever done.
The detail in these fragments has even allowed experts to identify who lived where. This house belonged to a man called Sennacherib. Though he appears to have been an ordinary worker, his home is a good size, and he could afford a tomb of his own, bearing images of his family.
Sennacherib was one of the workmen of the gang. His title is Shechem Ash. It means something that he who hears the order. So he is a normal workman, but he must have been wealthy enough to have a nice house and to have this very beautiful tomb.
The evidence unearthed here helps explain how the Egyptians could continue to produce extraordinary craftsmanship over a period of centuries. What they created here was a colony of highly valued craftsmen who handed down the secrets of their trade from generation to generation. Then, suddenly, after 500 years, all work in the Valley of the Kings stopped. Now archaeologists think they know why. Egyptologists have been digging in the Valley of the Kings for more than 200 years. Kent Weeks has devoted his life to mapping it, and it is still yielding surprises. Weeks and his team have been excavating one tomb since 1995, and they're still making new finds.
We realized within 10 minutes of getting into that room that we had uncovered the largest tomb ever found in the Valley of the Kings, and certainly one of the largest tombs ever found anywhere in Egypt. We are now up to about 130 corridors and chambers, and we have no end in sight.
This was the burial complex built for his family by Egypt's greatest pharaoh, Ramesses. In this single tomb, commissioned by just one king, there may be more than 150 chambers. It's unsurprising that in time, the valley became overcrowded, and Weeks has found ample evidence of the difficulties this caused. Since entrances were routinely concealed, anyone cutting a fresh tomb was working blind.
There was no master plan, and in fact, on 4 different occasions in antiquity, men digging one tomb accidentally ran into an earlier tomb that they hadn't realized was there.
After 500 years of building and at least 63 tombs, building in the Valley of the Kings ended. Ted Brock is visiting the last recorded tomb to be cut here. It belongs to Ramesses XI, who died 150 years after his predecessor, Ramesses the Great. From the evidence on the walls, work here stopped suddenly and before the job was done. Just inside the entrance are incomplete artist's sketches. Further into the tomb, the work peters out altogether. The rock is left bare and rough. The tunnel ends after 440 feet in a sudden vertical drop. Where one would expect to find a sarcophagus, there's only a shaft.
This unfinished last tomb to be constructed in the valley has this deep shaft in the floor, perhaps intended to take the king's burial. But as far as we can tell, the king, Ramesses XI, was never buried here.
The pharaoh's body has never been found. He was the last of his dynasty as a new generation of rulers took over. Egypt's new pharaohs made the ancient capital Thebes and the Valley of the Kings redundant.
The new rulers of Egypt come from the north. So they move the royal capital from Luxor, from Thebes, to the delta. And that's where they will be buried from now onwards. So at one point in the history of Egypt, around 1000 BC, the royal necropolis in the Valley of the King shuts, closes, never to be used again.
The community created to build tombs here suddenly had no purpose and no means of providing for itself. Some historians believe the workers were forced to consume what their ancestors had created.
They're not getting their wages paid on time by the state, and in order to feed their families, they turn to tomb robbery as a means of getting some gold and some income.
But tomb robbing wasn't just a covert, illicit activity. There's evidence that Egypt's priests turned it into a matter of policy, a large-scale operation.
They decide to reuse the gold, the bullion that has been buried underground. And there is evidence of official robbing, or perhaps better use the term recycling, of the gold and of the treasures that were buried underground.
This theory explains why, of more than 60 tombs found in the valley, only that of Tutankhamun was discovered intact. And still the valley is giving up secrets. In 2007, Dr. Zahi Hawass completed a series of scientific tests on this mummy. He believes he's finally identified it as the body of Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who transformed the Valley of the Kings.
Hatshepsut, in my opinion, one of the most greatest queen of history.
The Valley of the Kings is her legacy. Today we can marvel at the work that Hatshepsut started and others finished.
We have learned from it that there is much more to be found in the Valley of the Kings, much more of importance.
This place is a monument to the power of the pharaohs, to the force of their will, the vision of their engineers, and the skill of their craftsmen. The valley as we see it now is just a shadow of what it once was.
Think of the Valley of the Kings as a valley of gold. If we had everything that was ever buried there, we would have literally mountains of gold.
Next time on Secrets of Egypt, we look at the Superman of the rulers, Ramesses II, where we'll even get to see his mummified body. That's Tuesday night at 8, here on 5. Mummies is what we've got next too, as we look at the body from the Stone Age that miraculously has been preserved. And because of that, we know everything about him.